November 3, 1944. Somewhere over the North Pacific Ocean, 30,000 feet above the churning sea. A paper balloon the size of a two-story house caught a current of wind traveling 200 miles per hour eastward. It carried no pilot, no fuel, no radio, no guidance system. It carried a bomb, and it was heading for the United States of America. The weapon that would become known as the Fugo was at once the most primitive and the most sophisticated weapon system of World War II. Built from mulberry paper and rice paste, inflated with hydrogen, guided by nothing but physics, it crossed 5,000 miles of open ocean using a river of wind that Western meteorologists hadn't even formally named yet. What followed would become the most audacious long-range attack ever launched against the American mainland. A campaign of 9,300 balloons. A conspiracy of silence enforced by the American government itself. And a tragedy in an Oregon forest that the United States didn't want the world to know had happened. This is the story of the weapon that worked, the attack that succeeded, and the secret that a nation kept from itself while fighting for its life. To understand the Fugo balloon, you must first understand the jet stream. In the early 1940s, Western meteorologists understood that high-altitude winds existed over the Pacific. What they didn't fully grasp was the extraordinary consistency and velocity of what Japanese scientists had been studying for decades. A narrow band of atmosphere between 30,000 and 35,000 feet that screamed eastward from the Japanese islands toward North America at velocities sometimes exceeding 300 miles per hour. Japanese meteorologist Wasaburo Uishi had been measuring these upper atmospheric currents from Mount Tsukuba since the 1920s. He published his findings in 1926 in Esperanto, a language chosen for international scientific communication, which meant that almost nobody in the English-speaking scientific establishment ever read them. His discovery, essentially the discovery of the jet stream, sat in obscure scientific journals, while the weapon it would make possible remained unimagined. By 1942, Japanese military scientists had connected the dots. After the Doolittle raid of April 1942, when American B-25 bombers launched from USS Hornet attacked Tokyo and other Japanese cities, Japanese military leadership burned with the need to strike the American homeland directly. The Doolittle raid had caused minimal physical damage, but maximum psychological devastation. It proved that Japan's home islands were not invulnerable. It humiliated the military. It disturbed the emperor. Japan needed to answer. Submarines had already launched float planes that dropped incendiary bombs on Oregon forests in September 1942, the first enemy bombing of the continental United States since the War of 1812. The attack caused no fires. The submarines that launched them were vulnerable, expensive, and impossible to mass-produce for a sustained bombing campaign. The jet stream offered something else entirely: a free delivery system, one that required no pilot, no fuel, no airfield, no aircraft carrier, one that the Americans couldn't shoot down, couldn't intercept, couldn't predict. Major Sueki Kusaba of the 9th Army Technical Research Laboratory received the assignment. His team began work on what would become one of the most unusual weapons programs in military history. The Japanese military called it Fusen Bakudan, balloon bomb. The Americans, when they finally understood what they were dealing with, would call it the Fugo. The Fugo balloon was not built in a factory. It was assembled by hand, by Japanese schoolgirls and women, working in gymnasiums, theaters, and sumo wrestling arenas across Japan. The Kokugikan, Tokyo's great sumo hall, was converted into a balloon assembly facility. Its enormous interior provided the humidity-controlled space the work required. At its peak, the program employed nearly 10,000 civilian workers across multiple production sites. The design that Kusaba's team settled upon after extensive testing was deceptively elegant. A hydrogen-filled balloon, approximately 33 feet in diameter, constructed from panels of washi, traditional Japanese paper made from the bark of the kozo bush, laminated together with a paste made from konnyaku, a starchy plant used in Japanese cooking. The resulting material was extraordinarily lightweight, yet strong enough to survive the violent pressure fluctuations of the upper atmosphere. Each completed balloon weighed just 152 pounds. Each could carry a payload of 1,000 pounds when fully inflated. Each balloon required approximately 600 individual paper panels, hand-glued together by workers using their fingers to smooth each seam. The work was done in buildings deliberately kept humid to prevent the paper from cracking. Workers were prohibited from eating rice before shifts because the starch on their hands interfered with the adhesive. They developed calluses on their fingertips. The glue smelled like the paste their grandmothers used in kitchens. The work was precise, repetitive, and completely unexplained to those doing it. The women were not told what they were making. They were told they were making weapons for the emperor. They were told their work was secret. They were told Japan would win the war because of what their hands were building in gymnasiums that still smelled like school. The secrecy was complete. According to post-war testimonies collected by American military historians, most workers had no idea their gymnasium-assembled paper creations would cross an ocean. Some thought they were making barrage balloons for harbor defense. Some had no theory at all. They glued panels and smoothed seams and reported to work the next day. The altitude control system was the engineering masterpiece of the program. To survive a 3 to 5 day transoceanic crossing, the balloon needed to maintain a specific altitude range where the jet stream flowed with sufficient velocity. Too low, and the winds weakened and changed direction. Too high, and the hydrogen would expand from reduced atmospheric pressure, and the balloon would burst. Kusaba's team designed an automatic altimeter system using a barometric device that could detect altitude changes without human intervention. When the balloon descended too low during the cold Pacific nights, as the hydrogen contracted in frigid temperatures, the device triggered small explosive charges that cut loose sandbags suspended below the envelope. The balloon, lighter, would rise again into the jet stream. When it rose too high from daytime heating of the hydrogen gas, the device vented gas through an automatic relief valve. The system required no human intervention, no power source, no radio signal. It was purely mechanical, purely physical. It worked on pressure differential alone. Each balloon carried 32 sandbags as ballast, enough for 32 altitude corrections over the crossing. The system was calculated to last exactly long enough to cross the Pacific. When the last sandbag dropped, a timing device triggered the release of the ordnance and a flash device that would destroy the balloon envelope, leaving no evidence. The elegance was military. The precision was scientific. The materials were paper and paste, and the hands of schoolgirls. The payload consisted of a 33-pound incendiary device and 2 anti-personnel fragmentation bombs. The incendiary was designed to start forest fires. The fragmentation bombs were designed to kill anyone who came to investigate the fires. The anti-personnel logic was deliberate. Japanese military planners had studied American firefighting doctrine. They knew that fires in the Pacific Northwest would draw firefighters. The fragmentation bombs were for the firefighters. Between November 1944 and April 1945, the Japanese military launched approximately 9,300 Fugo balloons from 3 sites on the Japanese coast: Otsu, Ichinomiya, and Nakoso. Launch crews worked at night to avoid American submarines and aircraft. The balloons rose silently in the darkness above the Pacific coastline, caught the upper winds, and disappeared eastward. Each balloon was expected to take between 30 and 60 hours to cross the Pacific. Most of the year, the jet stream would deliver them reliably. Japanese meteorologists had chosen November as the launch date because the jet stream over Japan reaches its peak velocity in late autumn and winter. Japanese newspapers announced the program to the public with tremendous fanfare. The home islands were striking back. The American mainland would burn. Citizens gathered at launch sites to cheer balloons rising into the night sky. The program had no official name in public communications, referred to obliquely as a special weapon. But the intent was clear and the pride was real. Japan was bombing America. December 11th, 1944, Thermopolis, Wyoming. A ranch worker discovered something strange tangled in sagebrush near the town. Fragments of pale paper, strange rubber fittings, pieces of metal mechanism he couldn't identify. A few ordnance devices that he was fortunate enough not to touch. He reported it to local authorities, who reported it to the army, who sent investigators within 24 hours. The military investigation that followed was rapid, classified, and alarming. Army analysts examined the paper fragments under microscopes. Chemical tests identified the material as Japanese washi. Mineralogical analysis of the sand in the ballast bags was the most revealing discovery of all. Sand, unlike many materials, carries a mineralogical fingerprint. Its composition reflects the specific geology of the beach where it was collected. Army analysts from the Military Geology Unit identified the mineral profile of the Wyoming sand as consistent with beaches in a narrow region of Honshu and Japan's main island near the cities of Ichinomiya and Nakoso. The altitude control system, recovered largely intact, revealed engineering sophistication that surprised American military scientists. The barometric mechanism was not crude improvisation. It was a precision instrument manufactured to tight tolerances, designed by people who understood the physics of the upper atmosphere in detail. Whoever built this weapon had thought carefully about pressure differentials, about hydrogen expansion, about the mechanical challenges of operating at 35,000 feet in temperatures of -60 degrees Fahrenheit. Someone in Japan had not only identified the jet stream, they had built a weapon specifically engineered to use it. General Staff intelligence officers understood immediately what this meant. If Japan could deliver ordnance across the Pacific without aircraft, without submarines, the implications for American civilian morale could be severe if the public learned of it. More urgently, the forests of the Pacific Northwest were among the most fire-vulnerable ecosystems in North America. Incendiary attacks during the dry summer season could cause catastrophic damage to timber resources critical to the war effort. The Hanford nuclear site in Washington state, where plutonium for the atomic bomb was being produced, was surrounded by forest. The decision was made at the highest levels of the American wartime information apparatus. Total news blackout. The Office of Censorship, the wartime agency that coordinated voluntary compliance with news suppression among American media organizations, issued a confidential request to every newspaper, radio station, and newswire service in the country. Nothing about balloon bombs was to be published. Nothing about balloon sightings was to be broadcast. Nothing about any attacks on the American mainland was to reach the public. The request cited two reasons. First, public knowledge of attacks on American soil would damage civilian morale. Second, and more importantly, Japanese military intelligence was almost certainly monitoring American news sources for confirmation that their balloons were arriving. If the Japanese received no confirmation, they might conclude the program had failed and abandon it. The American press complied almost unanimously. Publishers, editors, and broadcasters across the country agreed to suppress information about one of the most unusual attacks in military history. This was not censorship through law. There was no legal requirement to comply. It was censorship through patriotism, through voluntary agreement, through the understanding shared by editors and generals alike that winning required sacrifice, and that the sacrifice of a story was small compared to the sacrifice of lives. The strategy worked beyond expectations. Japanese military intelligence, monitoring American newspapers, radio broadcasts, and wire services, found nothing. No reports of balloon arrivals. No reports of fires started by incendiary devices. No reports of unexploded ordnance found by ranchers or hikers. The silence was interpreted as evidence of failure. In Tokyo, the analysts concluded that the Fugo balloons were not reaching North America in meaningful numbers. The jet stream calculations, perhaps, were wrong. The barometric systems, perhaps, were failing. The balloons were falling into the ocean. In April 1945, with hydrogen production increasingly needed for other military purposes, and the broader war situation deteriorating rapidly, Japan terminated the Fugo program. The launch sites were shut down. The remaining balloons in inventory were repurposed or destroyed. The schoolgirls went back to their classrooms or were redirected to other war production. The Sumo Hall in Tokyo eventually resumed other uses. Of the 9,300 balloons launched, approximately 300 were confirmed as reaching North America. Researchers believe the actual number was significantly higher, with many landing in remote wilderness areas and never reported. They were found in Alaska, Washington, Oregon, California, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, Michigan, Texas, and as far east as Traverse City, Michigan. They were found in British Columbia and the Canadian Prairie provinces. One came down within miles of the Hanford nuclear site in Washington state. Its electrical components, had they caused a short circuit in the facility's power supply at a critical moment in plutonium production, might have delayed the Manhattan Project by weeks or months. It did not. The balloon fell into a field. The ordnance failed to detonate. A security patrol found it, and the incident was classified immediately. The blackout held. The Japanese terminated the program believing it had failed. For 6 months, the most sophisticated long-range attack ever launched against the American mainland remained the United States' most closely guarded domestic secret. Hundreds of incidents, dozens of states, thousands of military personnel, forest rangers, ranch workers, farmers, and ordinary civilians who saw something strange and were told to say nothing, and said nothing. Then came the morning of May 5, 1945, in the mountains of southern Oregon. And the secret became a tragedy. Elsie Mitchell was 26 years old. She was 5 months pregnant with her first child. Her husband Archie was the pastor of the Christian and Missionary Alliance Church in the small timber town of Bly, Oregon, population 500. Archie Mitchell was 26 years old, quiet and careful, while a man who had been classified 4F by the draft board due to a heart condition and spent the war years ministering to a community that was sending its young men away. On Saturday morning, May 5, 1945, Archie drove Elsie and 5 children from the church Sunday school to a picnic spot near Gearhart Mountain in the Fremont National Forest. The children were on a break from school. The day was clear and mild. The forest smelled of pine and thawed earth. It was the kind of spring morning that makes people in southern Oregon remember why they live there. Archie parked the car along a logging road and walked ahead to check the picnic area. From behind him, he heard the children shouting. They had found something in the trees, something strange, half buried in the undergrowth. Something with pale paper and rope, and a circular metal frame that meant nothing to children who had never been told to look for pale paper and rope and circular metal frames. He turned toward them. He shouted. He told them to stop, to come away, to leave it alone. He was not fast enough. The explosion was heard a mile away. A Forest Service worker reported it to the Lakeview District Ranger Station. Archie Mitchell, unhurt, found himself standing in a forest clearing with silence where children's voices had been. The explosion killed Elsie Mitchell and all 5 children instantly. They were the first and only American civilians killed by enemy action on the continental United States during World War II. Their names were Elsie Mitchell, age 26, Edward Engen, age 13, Jay Gifford, age 13, Sherman Shoemaker, age 11, Joan Patsky, age 13, Dick Patsky, age 14. Army personnel arrived within hours. The site was secured and thoroughly documented. Ordnance specialists confirmed what the evidence made obvious. A Japanese Fugo balloon bomb, its incendiary device failed to ignite in the damp spring forest, its anti-personnel fragmentation bombs intact. A weapon designed in Tokyo, assembled by schoolgirls in a converted sumo arena, launched from the Pacific coast on a winter night, carried 5,000 miles by a river of air, had come to rest in an Oregon forest and waited there for 5 months until a group of children found it on a Saturday morning in May. Local officials were asked by Army representatives to say nothing about what had happened. The community of Bly, a small, tight-knit logging town where everyone knew everyone, and the Mitchells had ministered for 3 years, Wines was instructed to remain silent about what had killed their children and their pastor's wife. The army explained that the information could compromise national security, that other lives might be saved by continued silence, that the program might not be finished. The people of WWII complied, out of patriotism, out of grief, out of a government's assurance that silence, even this silence, even silence about murdered children, would save other lives. 3 days later, the Office of Censorship lifted the blackout on balloon bomb information. The calculation had shifted. The Japanese had already terminated the program in April. The operational security purpose of the blackout no longer existed, but the balloons that had already been launched continued to drift and land. Unexploded devices in remote forests, on ranch lands, along hiking trails, supposed ongoing danger to civilians who had no idea what to avoid. The warning was now more important than the secrecy. Newspaper headlines across America carried the story simultaneously on May 9, 1945. Japanese balloon bombs had been attacking the United States for 6 months. Hundreds had reached North American soil. They had been found in more than a dozen states and 2 Canadian provinces. 6 Americans, 5 of them children, had been killed in an Oregon forest. The American public, which had known nothing, read the news over breakfast and went to work. The reaction was less panic than puzzlement. The war in Europe was essentially over. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The Pacific War was grinding toward its conclusion through island campaigns and carrier strikes. Japanese paper balloons seemed, to a war-exhausted public, like a strange footnote rather than a revelation. But the footnote contained a fact that journalists were careful to emphasize. The Japanese had bombed the American mainland. The American government had known about it for 6 months, and 6 people were dead. The Fugo strategic objective was never mass civilian casualties. The Japanese military planners who designed the campaign understood clearly that 33-pound incendiary bombs scattered randomly across a continent of 3 million square miles could not replicate strategic bombing. Precision was impossible. Concentration was impossible. Targeting was impossible. A weapon guided by wind cannot be aimed. The objective was fire. The forests of the Pacific Northwest, the Cascade Range, the coastal mountains of Oregon and Washington, the inland forests of Idaho and Montana, were among the most commercially and industrially vital timber resources in the United States. They supplied lumber for military construction at a rate American industry had never previously achieved. New warships required vast quantities of timber for decking, framing, and interior work. Military bases across the Pacific Theater consumed lumber by the shipload. The forests were economically irreplaceable in the short term and deeply vulnerable to fire during the summer dry season. A fire in the Cascades in August could burn for weeks before being controlled. The Japanese strategic calculation was precise. If several hundred incendiary balloons could simultaneously ignite forest fires across the Pacific Northwest during the July and August dry season, American military and civilian firefighting resources would be overwhelmed. The Forest Service, already operating with reduced manpower because of the draft, could not respond to simultaneous fires across multiple states. Timber production for the war effort would be disrupted for months. The psychological impact of fires burning across the American mainland, visible from cities, threatening communities, destroying the forests that generations of Pacific Northwest families had lived among, would damage civilian morale in ways that no amount of government propaganda could easily counteract. The calculation was not unreasonable. Multiple balloons did cause fires. A device landed in a Montana forest in March 1945 and started a blaze that required Forest Service crews to contain. Several balloons caused spot fires in Washington and Oregon that were extinguished quickly by rangers who had been quietly briefed on the danger. At a power substation serving the Hanford facility, a balloon brought down a power line and caused a brief interruption in electrical service. The interruption lasted minutes. Production at Hanford was not affected. But the program failed to achieve its incendiary objectives for one reason above all others: timing. The jet stream crossing took 3 to 5 days regardless of Japanese intentions. The laws of physics do not accommodate military scheduling. Japanese meteorologists had selected November as the launch month because the jet stream reaches peak velocity over Japan in autumn and winter, ensuring fast crossings and reliable delivery. What they could not change was the season at the point of arrival. Balloons launched in November arrived in November. Balloons launched in January arrived in January. Balloons launched in March arrived in March. The Pacific Northwest in November through April is not dry. It rains, continuously and heavily, and with the particular persistence of a maritime climate that receives 80 inches of annual precipitation in its wettest zones. The forests of Oregon and Washington in winter are soaked. The undergrowth is saturated. The deadfall is wet through. An incendiary device that might start a catastrophic fire in the same forest in August finds nothing to catch in January. The fires that were started in winter months went out in the rain before anyone needed to fight them. To achieve the incendiary objective, Japan needed to launch the Fugo campaign in April or May so that balloons would arrive in July and August during peak fire danger. Launching in April would also have given the program the benefit of months of accumulated production, sending larger numbers of balloons in a more concentrated period. The program launched in November 1944 and terminated in April 1945. The window of potential catastrophic success, July and August 1945, fell entirely after the program had ended. If Japanese military planners had delayed the program by 4 months, the fires of the summer of 1945 might have presented the United States with a domestic crisis unlike anything it had faced on its own soil since the Civil War. They launched in November. The rain stopped what the censorship and the timing and the American military had not needed to stop. The forests of the Pacific Northwest were saved from catastrophe by the same weather that made them forests. The Fugo program officially ended in April 1945. The last balloon lifted from the Japanese coast sometime in early April, its exact launch date unrecorded. It crossed the Pacific in the jet stream, its barometric system releasing sandbags as the hydrogen contracted in the cold nights, venting gas as the sun warmed the envelope each morning. Its ordnance was armed and ready. Its timing device was counting down. It landed somewhere in North America. Nobody knows where. The balloons already in the air when the program terminated continued to travel. Some crossed the Pacific successfully and landed in North America weeks after Japan had decided the program had failed. Some never made it, losing hydrogen to slow leaks over the ocean, and descending gradually into the North Pacific in places too remote and too deep for anyone to ever find them. The floor of the North Pacific beneath the jet stream holds the remnants of hundreds of Fugo balloons that crossed 4,000 miles of ocean and then quietly settled through the water column into the sediment below. Their ordnance unfired, their mission unaccomplished, unknown to anyone alive and unknown to anyone who will ever live. Some balloons, their ballast and ordnance expended, made lighter than their design parameters by the loss of payload, may have remained aloft indefinitely in the upper atmosphere, riding circular winds above the Pacific long after the war that created them had ended. The hydrogen leaking away over months, the paper panels slowly degrading in ultraviolet light, the barometric mechanisms corroding in the cold until at some point in 1946 or 1947, or perhaps later, the envelope collapsed and what remained of them drifted to Earth in some unmapped wilderness, unnoticed and unreported, and long forgotten by the nation that built them. Unexploded Fugo devices continued to be discovered for decades after the war. A Canadian forest worker found a nearly complete example in British Columbia in 1955, 10 years after the war ended, its ordnance still armed. A group of boys discovered a similar device in Alaska the same year, still capable of detonating. The Army bomb disposal units that responded to these discoveries treated each one with the same caution they would have given a fresh weapon, because they were fresh weapons. Japanese manufacturing quality, combined with the dry cold of high-altitude forests, had preserved the explosives in serviceable condition for a decade. A rancher in a remote area of British Columbia found a Fugo balloon in 1997. 52 years after the war that produced it. The silk envelope was largely intact. The barometric mechanism had corroded but remained identifiable. The ordnance was still present. Bomb disposal specialists from the Canadian military were called. The device was neutralized safely. The rancher, who had been born after the war ended, had no frame of reference for what he had found until authorities explained it. The last confirmed unexploded Fugo ordnance device was discovered and safely detonated by a bomb disposal team in a remote area of British Columbia in 2014. The device had been lying in the forest for approximately 70 years, and the forest had grown up around it. Trees that were saplings when it landed had become mature timber. The war that launched it had been over for 7 decades. The nation that built it had become one of America's closest allies. The schoolgirls who assembled it were, if alive at all, elderly women in their 80s, who almost certainly had never known what their work ultimately created, or where it ultimately came to rest. The Fugo program is studied today in military engineering curricula, in meteorological research programs, in strategic analysis courses at war colleges in multiple countries. It is studied because it worked. Not strategically, in the sense that Japan achieved its stated objectives of setting American forests ablaze and damaging civilian morale. The program failed almost completely. Approximately 300 confirmed arrivals out of 9,300 launches. 6 American civilians killed. No strategic fires started. No measurable impact on American war production or civilian morale. It worked as engineering. The conceptual achievement of Kusaba's team was genuine and historically significant. Designing an unpowered, unguided, unmanned weapon capable of reliably crossing 5,000 miles of open ocean using only atmospheric wind currents, maintaining precise altitude through a purely mechanical control system, operating at temperatures of -60 degrees Fahrenheit for 60 continuous hours, was an achievement that the military technology of 1944 had no obvious right to accomplish. The weapon worked as designed. The delivery system functioned correctly. The failures were strategic and meteorological, not engineering. The Fugo program also confirmed, through military application, the existence and transoceanic navigability of the jet stream 2 decades before commercial aviation would begin deliberately using it to reduce fuel consumption on Pacific crossings. Japanese military meteorology had developed a more sophisticated understanding of upper atmospheric dynamics than Western scientists had published. The balloons proved the thesis. Today, every commercial airliner flying from Tokyo to San Francisco uses the same wind system to reduce flight time and fuel consumption. The pilots know its name. The passengers sleep through it. The scale of the program reveals the scale of the belief behind it. Japan built and launched 9,300 weapons. Constructing 9,300 of any weapons platform, recruiting and training 10,000 workers, converting major public buildings to production facilities, establishing 3 launch sites, represents serious strategic commitment from a nation whose resources were, by late 1944, severely strained. Japan did not launch 9,300 paper balloons as an experiment or a gesture. Japan launched 9,300 paper balloons because its military leadership genuinely believed the program could succeed. The belief was wrong. The commitment was real. The American censorship response proved something equally important about democratic societies at war. A nation with a constitutionally protected free press, with thousands of balloon incidents occurring across dozens of states, with military personnel and forest rangers and ranch hands and farmers and ordinary citizens, all finding strange paper objects in fields and forests and mountain sagebrush. I maintained total operational security for 6 months. Not through law, not through threat, not through the apparatus of state coercion that Japan used to keep its own wartime secrets, through voluntary agreement, through shared purpose, through editors and publishers and radio broadcasters deciding independently that the story could wait. The system worked almost perfectly. Almost. It did not protect the people of Bly, Oregon. It did not warn Elsie Mitchell or Edward Engen or Jay Gifford or Sherman Shoemaker or Joan Patsky or Dick Patsky, that something dangerous was lying in the forest where they were going to have a picnic on a Saturday morning in May. The censorship that was designed to save lives could not save those 6 lives, because the censorship that was designed to end the program had already ended the program. And the program's last weapon in that particular forest had been waiting patiently since winter. A monument stands today in the Fremont National Forest, near the site where Elsie Mitchell and 5 children were killed. The Forest Service calls the area the Mitchell Recreation Area. A stone marker carries a plaque that reads, "In memory of those who lost their lives here, May 5, 1945, as a result of an enemy bomb." There is a small parking area. There is a trail through the trees. On weekends in summer, families from Bly and Klamath Falls and the surrounding area sometimes stop there. Some of them know the story. Some of them are reading the plaque for the first time. It is the only monument on continental American soil marking the deaths of civilians killed by enemy fire during World War II. The paper balloon that killed them crossed 5,000 miles of ocean using a wind that Western meteorologists wouldn't formally name for another decade. It was designed by engineers who understood the physics of the atmosphere well enough to build a machine that could navigate it without a pilot. It was assembled by the hands of Japanese schoolgirls who were never told what they were building. It was discovered by American children who had never been warned what to look for. It killed 5 children and a pregnant woman in a forest on a clear spring morning, and then the army came, and there was nothing left to explain to the families except that it was an enemy weapon, and the enemy was already defeated, and the war would be over soon. The river of wind that carried it still flows. Every winter, 30,000 feet above the Pacific, the jet stream accelerates off the Japanese coast and screams eastward toward North America at velocities that would have seemed impossible to most meteorologists in 1930. Commercial airliners ride it from Tokyo to San Francisco, shaving 3 hours off the eastbound crossing, their passengers watching films or sleeping in reclined seats somewhere above the dark water below the level where the balloons traveled, above the place where the Pacific holds its collection of paper and silk and unexploded ordnance in the cold sediment of its floor. The passengers don't know about the balloons. The pilots know about the jet stream. Nobody on board is thinking about a sumo arena converted to a weapons factory, or about schoolgirls smoothing paper seams with calloused fingertips, or about a pastor's wife 5 months pregnant walking into an Oregon forest on a Saturday morning in May 1945. The wind that carried the balloons is still there, moving fast, moving east, moving as it always has, without knowledge of what it carries or where it is going or what will happen when it arrives. If you've made it this far, drop a balloon in the comments. And if this story stayed with you the way it stayed with us, subscribe, leave a like, and share this video with someone who thinks they know everything about World War II. Now click on this video right here. Trust us. You won't believe what happened.